London, February 11th, 2010. It's a cold, grey Thursday morning, the kind of morning that feels like a heavy wool coat pressing down on your shoulders. But in a luxury apartment in Mayfair, the air has stopped moving entirely. The news breaks, and it feels like a physical blow to the stomach of the fashion world. Alexander McQueen is gone. Now, let's be honest. When we think of high fashion, we think of champagne, bright lights, and models who look like they've never felt a day of pain in their lives. But McQueen, he didn't care about the champagne. He cared about the blood, the bone, and the beautiful, terrifying darkness that lives inside every one of us. They called him the Hooligan of fashion. They called his work savage. Critics looked at his shows and saw madness. They saw dresses made of razor clams, models walking through fire, and masks that looked like bird cages. They asked, why does he hate women? Why is it so ugly? But here is the logic that everyone missed. McQueen didn't hate women. He was obsessed with making them untouchable. He grew up in the East End of London, watching the women in his life suffer, and he decided to use his scissors to build them a suit of armor. He once said, "I want people to be afraid of the women I dress." So why does his story still haunt us? Why did a man who had conquered Paris, won every award imaginable, and was worth millions, decide that he couldn't stay for one more day? To understand the end, we have to go back to the beginning. Not to the runways of Milan, but to the gritty, loud streets of Lewisham, where a taxi driver's son began to see ghosts in the fabric. This is the story of Alexander McQueen, the man who proved that sometimes the most beautiful things in the world are the ones that hurt the most. Lee wasn't supposed to be a fashion designer, not in the East End. In the 1970s, in a house filled with 5 older siblings and a taxi driver dad, you were expected to be tough. You weren't expected to draw Cinderellas on the back of wallpaper. Imagine the noise of that house, the TV blaring, the city hum outside, the constant movement of a large family. But in the middle of it all, there was Lee, a quiet boy who spent his time sketching dresses for his sisters. He saw things other people didn't. He saw the way fabric moved, yes, but more importantly, he saw the way the world treated women.
Now, here is a piece of his story that is often whispered but rarely understood. As a child, Lee witnessed a horrific act of violence against one of his older sisters. He watched from the shadows as she was abused. Most people would be broken by that, but Lee, he took that trauma and turned it into a weapon. This is the logic flip of Alexander McQueen. Most designers start with the idea of pretty. They want to make a woman look like a flower or a princess. But McQueen started with the idea of fear. He realized that if you dress a woman in something sharp, something powerful, something that makes her look like a predator, nobody can hurt her again. He wasn't making clothes, he was making bulletproof vests for the soul. His father, Ronald, didn't understand. A taxi driver doesn't usually see art in a sketchbook. He wanted Lee to have a trade, something solid, something British. So, at 16, Lee left school with almost no qualifications. He walked down to Savile Row, the legendary home of the world's finest tailors, and asked for a job. He was a kid in a tracksuit, surrounded by men in 3-piece suits. They thought he was just a delivery boy. They had no idea that this nobody from the East End was about to learn the rules of tailoring just so he could burn them all down. He was about to learn how to cut a jacket so perfectly that it felt like a second skin. But inside that skin, he was still hiding those secret messages. Savile Row is the holy ground of British tailoring. It's a place where tradition isn't just a word, it's the law. Men in white gloves handle fabrics that cost more than a small car, and every stitch must be invisible. This is where 16-year-old Alexander McQueen walked in, smelling of East End grit, and asked for an apprenticeship. He landed at Anderson and Shepherd, then Gives and Hawkes, the tailors to the kings and the nobility. Now, here's a perspective most people miss. Lee wasn't there to fit in. He was there to steal their secrets. While the other apprentices were focused on making a nice suit, Lee was obsessing over the architecture of the human body. He learned how to manipulate wool so it would curve exactly where he wanted it to. He mastered the rules of construction so perfectly that he knew exactly how to break them later. But he couldn't help himself. The rebellion was already bubbling under the surface.
There's a legendary story, some call it a myth, that many believe it's true, that while working on a suit for Prince Charles, Lee took a piece of chalk or a needle and thread and scrawled a very, let's say, colourful message inside the lining. Think about the logic of that for a second. This wasn't just a childish prank, it was a declaration of war. It was a young man from the bottom of the social ladder saying, "I am here, I am better than you, and you're wearing my secret rebellion on your back." But even then, his talent was undeniable. He left the Row and eventually ended up at St. Martin's to do a master's degree. He didn't even have an undergraduate degree, but they saw his portfolio and realized this isn't a student, this is a master. His graduation show in 1992 was called Jack the Ripper Stalks His Victims. He used locks of human hair sewn into the linings of the clothes. It was dark, it was disturbing, and sitting in the front row was a woman who would change his life forever, Isabella Blow. She was a woman of blue blood and eccentric hats, a fixture of the British aristocracy who felt like an outsider in her own world. When she met Lee, it wasn't just a business transaction, it was a collision of two lonely souls who recognized each other's scars. Isabella didn't just buy his clothes, she championed his chaos. She would call him at all hours, pushing him, praising him, and introducing him to the right people Lee usually wanted to punch in the face. She saw the savage beauty before anyone else did. But here is the logic that's often overlooked. Isabella gave Lee the platform, but she also inadvertently placed him under a microscope he wasn't ready for. By the mid-90s, the British press had found their favourite new villain. They dubbed him the Hooligan of fashion. Why? Because he didn't play the pretty game. Take his 1995 show Highland Rape. Models staggered down the runway in torn lace, their hair matted, looking like they had survived a massacre. The critics were horrified. They accused him of glamorizing violence against women. They called him a misogynist.
But if you look at the logic behind the fabric, the truth was the exact opposite. McQueen wasn't talking about women, he was talking about history. He was Scottish by heritage, and Highland Rape was his way of screaming about the rape of Scotland by the English during the Highland clearances. He was using the runway to process ancestral trauma. He once said, "I don't want to make clothes for a woman to look like a doll in a window. I want her to look like she could kill." This is where we see the divide. To the media, he was a hooligan seeking attention. To Lee, he was a historian with a pair of scissors. But the pressure of being the bad boy was starting to take its toll. He was living in a world of luxury and champagne, yet he still felt like that kid in a tracksuit from Lewisham. He was caught between his East End roots and his high fashion future. And then, just when everyone thought he couldn't get any more controversial, the most traditional fashion house in Paris came calling. They wanted the hooligan to lead them. They wanted the conquering English savage to save French couture. He was about to step into the mouth of the lion, and he was bringing his own cage with him. In 1996, the world of high fashion experienced a seismic shift. Bernard Arnault, the head of LVMH, made a move that sounded like a punchline to a joke. He hired the Hooligan of London to lead Givenchy.
the most elegant and traditional house in Paris. Imagine Lee, the boy from Lewisham who still spoke with a thick working-class accent, walking into a French atelier where the seamstresses had spent decades making dresses for Audrey Hepburn. To the French elite, he wasn't a genius, he was a barbarian at the gates. They looked at his rough hands and his tattoos, and they saw a threat to their culture. Now, here's the logic flip of this era. People think getting a job at a legendary French house is the ultimate dream, but for Lee, it was a gilded cage. He was suddenly making millions, flying private jets and staying in the finest hotels, but he was also miserable. He felt like a performing beast kept in a glass cage for the amusement of the wealthy. His first collection for Givenchy was an ambitious interpretation of Greek mythology, featuring models with golden wings. The critics didn't just dislike it, they were brutal. They called it a fiasco. Lee, never one to hide his feelings, fired back by calling his own debut crap.
But why did he struggle so much in Paris? Because Alexander McQueen didn't design for customers, he designed for himself. At Givenchy, he had to care about brand identity and sales figures. He was a wild animal being told to walk in a straight line. The isolation was profound. He didn't speak the language, he hated the pretension, and he missed the raw energy of London. He began to realize that money and status were actually his enemies. They were distractions from the savage beauty he was trying to capture. He stayed at Givenchy for 5 years, but he was counting the days until he could be his own master again. By the time he left in 2001, he had learned everything Paris could teach him about luxury, but he had lost a piece of his soul in the process. He was ready to return to London and create the masterpieces that would define the 21st century. But the shadows he brought back from Paris were longer and darker than anyone realized. When Lee returned to London, he wasn't just a designer anymore. He was a conductor of shared trauma. He stopped caring about whether the clothes were wearable and started focusing on whether they were unforgettable. Think about the 1999 show Number 13. The finale wasn't a walk, it was a performance. Model Shalom Harlow stood on a rotating platform in a simple white dress. Suddenly, 2 massive robotic arms, the kind used to paint cars, began to move. They looked like predators. They started spraying her with yellow and black paint over and over while she spun, defenseless. Now, here is the logic flip. Most people saw a cool stunt, but look deeper. It was a metaphor for the human spirit being battered by the cold, mechanical world. It was beautiful, but it was also a violation. Shalom looked like a wounded swan, and for a moment the audience forgot they were at a fashion show. They felt her vulnerability. Then came Voss in 2001. Lee made the audience sit in front of a giant mirrored box for an hour before the show even started. They had to look at themselves. They were uncomfortable, fidgeting, unable to look away from their own reflections. Why? Because Lee wanted to show them that they were the ones obsessed with appearances, not him. When the lights finally came up inside the box, it was a psychiatric ward. The show ended with a glass box shattering to reveal a woman breathing through a tube covered in live moths.
Critics called it disturbing, but for Lee it was the only way to be honest. He was saying, "This is what my mind feels like. Is it too much for you?" And finally, Plato's Atlantis in 2010. This was his final masterpiece. He envisioned a world where the ice caps had melted and humans had to evolve to live underwater. The shoes, the famous armadillo heels, looked like they belonged to a different species. It was the first fashion show ever to be live streamed to the world. But here is the heartbreaking irony.
While Lee was showing us the future of humanity, he was losing his grip on his own present. Behind the alien-like beauty and the digital prints was a man who was exhausted by the very world he was trying to save through his art. He had become the greatest storyteller of his generation, but as he was about to find out, some stories are too heavy for even a genius to carry alone. By 2007, the savage beauty was starting to bleed. The fashion industry had become a high-speed machine, demanding 14 collections a year. Imagine that for a second. Every 3 months, you are expected to reinvent the world, to be more shocking, more brilliant, more McQueen than the last time. It's a hamster wheel made of gold, and Lee was running until his lungs burned. Then the first pillar fell. Isabella Blow, the woman who had discovered him, his oxygen, took her own life in 2007. They had drifted apart as his fame grew, caught in the petty jealousies and pressures of the industry. When she died, Lee was devastated by a guilt that no amount of success could wash away. He dedicated his next show, La Dame Bleue, to her, filling the runway with giant neon wings and her favorite scents, but the silence she left behind was loud. Now here is a perspective that many people overlook. Lee didn't just feel sad, he felt hunted. He was a human being living in a world of mannequins. He once said, "The fashion industry is like a vampire. It sucks you dry and moves on to the next victim." He was the most successful designer in the world, but he felt like he was being eaten alive by his own creation.
The final blow came in February 2010. His mother, Joyce, the woman who had kept his childhood sketches, the one person who truly knew Lee and not just McQueen, passed away. She was his anchor. Without her, the ship was adrift in a storm it couldn't survive. On February 11th, 2010, the eve of his mother's funeral, Lee made a choice. He didn't want to be a hooligan anymore. He didn't want to be a savage. He just wanted to be with the only person who had ever loved him without wanting a piece of his genius. The world reacted with shock, but if you look at the logic of his life, the end was his final act of control. He refused to let the industry finish him. He finished the story on his own terms. He left behind a half-finished collection, Angels and Demons, full of medieval tapestries and religious iconography. It was his most peaceful work. It was as if, at the very end, the boy from the East End had finally found the armor he had been trying to build for 30 years. Alexander McQueen didn't just leave behind a brand, he left a hole in the sky of the creative world. For a long time after February 2010, the fashion industry felt strangely quiet, like the music had stopped and the lights had dimmed, but nobody wanted to leave the theater. But then, in 2011, something extraordinary happened. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York opened a retrospective of his work called Savage Beauty. Now, usually fashion exhibits are for the elite, but this was different. Over 650,000 people stood in line for hours, winding around the block in the heat and the rain, just to see his ghosts. It became one of the most visited exhibitions in the museum's history.
Why? Because McQueen did something no other designer had the courage to do. He made our ugliness beautiful. He took our fears, our traumas, and our darkest thoughts and turned them into silk and lace. He proved that you don't have to be perfect to be a masterpiece. Here is the final logic flip of Lee's life. We often think of nostalgia as looking back at a simpler time, but looking back at McQueen isn't simple. It's challenging. It's raw. He forces us to remember that the good old days were also full of struggle and shadows. He reminds us that true art isn't something you look at, it's something that looks back at you and asks, do you see yourself in this? Today, the House of McQueen continues, but there will never be another Lee. He was a once-in-a-century storm that blew through London and Paris, tearing down the curtains and showing us the truth. He was the taxi driver's son who became a king, only to realize that he preferred the company of angels. So the next time you see something that is too much, something that feels a bit too dark or a bit too strange, don't look away. Remember the boy from the East End who wasn't afraid to stare into the abyss until the abyss started to sparkle. Because in the end, that is the real savage beauty.